School of Humanities lecture series. I'm delighted to introduce Kenny Brophy from Archeology, and Kenny's going to tell us about Ludovic McLellan, Mann, and Clydebank prehistory. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for coming along. As I said to Michael, really today don't necessarily expect a huge amount of academic depth and content. This is just a very strange episode, really, which is worth recounting, but there are kind of various different broader research outcomes that will develop over the coming years in terms of this project. Okay. So on 18 September 1937, the Glasgow Archaeological Society ran a field trip to visit some remarkable archaeological sites in Clydebank that were the focus of weird archaeological investigations. And the members gathered in the city centre with their kilts and +4s, their binoculars and walking sticks, and filed onto a charabanc that had been hired for the occasion. They'd been invited by the former president of the society, Ludovic McLellan Mann, to visit two sites which he'd recently been investing a lot of time, intellect, creativity and passion on. One of these sites, Nappers, was a complex of ceremonial and burial monuments which Mann believed was an internationally significant Stone Age temple on a par with Stonehenge. And the other was the Cockno Stone, which is a large outcrop of rock art symbols dating back to the Neolithic period, which Mann used as a canvas to play out some of his more eccentric theories and ideas. And in the archives for the Society, it's noted that during the field trip, Mann described Nappers as a great prehistoric temple built of wood, while the Cockno Stone was, he said, was completely uncovered and prepared for ultimate permanent protection. And Mann's overblown claims for both these sites were very much in character. And it's likely this was a tense day because by then Mann's relationship with the Society was quite ropey. This was a pivotal day and a pivotal year for Mann. For him, it must have seemed like vindication for 3 decades of tireless research, his promotion of Scottish archaeology, and a chance to once again get the approval of his peers in the archaeological establishment, because as an amateur archaeologist, he never really truly belonged to that establishment. That may not have been how it turned out, however, and in hindsight, in 1937, and perhaps even this particular field trip in 1937, was more likely a tipping point, with Mann's eccentricities becoming clear to everyone who went along with him that day. And it may well be that this is the day that Mann's journey into the archaeological wilderness really began to seem like a one-way ticket to the very fringes of the discipline. So this lunchtime, I want to explore Ludovic Mann's legacy based on the activities that began in summer of 1937 in Clydebank, where he worked on 2 genuinely important prehistoric sites, but ultimately both became somewhat overshadowed by Mann's personality. Both Nappers and the Cockno Stone were physically transformed as part of the process in ways that at the time were frowned upon and now would be positively illegal. Mann became unable to see the true value of the work he was doing with the public and the archaeology, and instead became a prisoner of his own obsessive delusions and perhaps also intoxicated with a late career brush with fame. But this doesn't mean he wasn't doing important work. So where does the truth lie between the man and the myth? On the brink of the 150th anniversary of Mann's birth, perhaps it's time to try to rehabilitate Mann's reputation. And I want to argue that because as a polymath, a public archaeologist, a man ahead of his time, and a great Glaswegian eccentric, he deserves better than be a curious footnote in the history of Scottish archaeology and almost unknown in his own city. Okay. Ludovic Mann. So Ludovic McLellan Mann was by trade an insurance broker, and indeed he patented his own system of consequential fire loss indemnity, which was widely adopted in that industry. His father John was a keen antiquarian and accountant. His mother, Mary Newton Harrington, was a novelist, and 2 of his brothers, Harrington and Alexander, and a niece, Kathleen, were all noted painters. He grew up in Langside in the south side of Glasgow. In 1901, he became a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, hinting at a parallel career as an aspiring archaeologist, though he never truly was accepted by the establishment. And in the end, leading academics took to print to condemn and mock him. It's only since 2000 that researchers such as Graham Ritchie and Katinka Dalgleish have begun to try to rehabilitate his reputation. However, Mann did have a high profile within the Glasgow Archaeological Society, being the president of that organisation between 1931 and 1933, and for the early part of his career had broad-ranging interests in Scottish archaeology and history, carrying out numerous excavations, and he was published widely. In 1911, he curated the prehistoric gallery of the Scottish Exhibition in Kelvingrove Park, which is the result of 2 years of work by Mann. And the exhibition space, as you can see here, was crammed full of hundreds of pots, stone tools and metal weapons, reconstructions, scale models, and the walls were adorned with 16 large wall charts, all of which Mann had designed and curated. Prehistoric tableaux were created using the soil of Glasgow, extracted from Mann's excavation sites. And the central feature of the gallery was a life-size statue of a typical man of the late Stone Age, sculpted by Alexander Proudfoot, who's a sort of white silhouette in the background there. A series of decent quality excavations, eclectic collecting activities and innovative research projects maintained his profile, but by the mid-1920s his reputation and activities began to change. Archaeologist Graham Ritchie noted that by 1923, and I'll quote here, Mann seems to have lost his ability to prepare coherent excavation reports, perhaps because some of his discoveries were piecemeal and because site survey was not his strong point. Mann also had a tendency towards losing interest in projects before bringing them to a conclusion, which many of us probably can recognise, and in time veered towards the fantastical and eccentric in his interpretations of his prehistoric discoveries, which alienated him theoretically as well as methodologically from his peers. Those who knew him, such as Ronald Morris, who was another eccentric amateur archaeologist, noted that once Mann had made up his mind about something, he would never change it. And Mann's work on prehistoric Clydebank firmly belongs to this part of his career. He started to bypass mainstream academic publishing, and his methods were simple. He watched out for opportunities to help with and drive forward excavations based on chance discoveries, subscribing to news clipping services such as Durant's. In the Glasgow area, such opportunities usually came about in sand and gravel quarries, such as Green Oak Hill in Mount Vernon, shown in the slide here, and Patrick Home near Hamilton, where he excavated Bronze Age kiss cemeteries. Sand and gravel extraction also revealed a rare Neolithic settlement site at Townhead and Rossie in the island of Bute, which he excavated as quarrying operations continued just before the First World War. And his most famous excavation at Nappers was also in a sand and gravel quarry, an environment he seems to have been very much at home in. He also investigated sites in advance of other developments such as housing and schools at Langside, Baillieston and Cambuslang in the greater Glasgow area. He would generally move in and take control of such situations, probably often to the relief of the developer or the quarry owner. And he cultivated close working relationships with the foremen and managers that he worked with. And all the while he talked to local journalists and national newspapers, disseminating the results, reporting on his work, bypassing the conventional, traditional academic publications that rarely, if ever, included his work from the late 1920s onwards. He even set up his own eponymous publishing imprint and spoke widely to public audiences to better inform them of the prehistoric stuff he was finding. Mann was also a voracious collector of antiquities, some from his own excavations or his travels abroad, and he donated many of these to the Kelvingrove Museum, where he seems to have exerted some level of control on how these were to be displayed and what the labels would say, although later in his career, again, this control was stopped. And after his excavations, like a serial killer, he kept souvenirs and trophies to remind him of his work. The Bronze Age cinerary urns from his first prehistoric dig in Glasgow, near where he was brought up in Langside, remained in his possession until his death 50 years later, one of his many unorthodoxies. Mann's research became increasingly about his own obsessions, which were essentially in the areas of prehistoric measurements and arcane cosmological theorising. He was very much an intellectual polymath and shared many interests with Alfred Watkins. His near contemporary was best remembered as the man who invented or discovered ley lines in the 1920s. Watkins was interested in what Robert McLellan listed as philology, geography, archaeology, etymology, entomology, and Egyptology, and Mann dabbled in all of these, as well as astronomy and geology, and is noted above he had a very artistic family, which was another influence on him. And this all came to head in a series of important but much disputed publications. Mann's obsession with measurements, which Ritchie identified as being as evident as early as 1915, led to two self-published pamphlets or short books, Craftsman's Measures in Ancient Times in 1930 and Measures, Their Origin and Meaning in 1938. Mann postulated there were two standard measurement schemes in use in prehistory, as he called them alpha and beta units. These were, he argued, the basis for all material culture, rock art symbols and building units, and he handily published grids of these scales to enable anyone to lay a prehistoric object on top of them to establish the veracity of his idea. In response to this research, the Glasgow Archeological Society and the Geological Society of Glasgow established a committee that sat between 1937 and 1937 with the specific aim to debunk Mann's measurement schemes. Although, as we'll see at the Cocknell Stone, this only emboldened Mann, even though it may also have taken a toll on his health, Ritchie noting that several extended periods of illness coincided with these years. Mann's main statement on his more arcane cosmological, archaeological history ethnography mashup approach can be found in a remarkable self-published short book from 1938 called Earliest Glasgow, A Temple of the Moon. Here, Mann set out in a 14-page section the mystical, ancient, pagan, prehistoric origins of Glasgow, evoked primarily through place names, some of which were on maps current at the time, others which he discovered due to his own research and encyclopedic knowledge of ephemera. The narrative was a distillation of decades of bits and pieces of information and diverse academic and esoteric influences that Mann had stored away in his copious notes and picked up during his extensive correspondence and collection of news cuttings. The outcome of this narrative and his research was that he identified an occult grid underlying the modern plan of Glasgow City, a grid constructed from alignments which he saw as routeways with astronomical connections which connected sacred places. His account of this grid is outlandish but compelling. He talked about the Neolithic philosopher laid out the Glasgow area on a plan similar to that of a clock face and like a gigantic spider's web, but rigorously geometrical. So Mann's poor archaeological reputation was sealed by this creative burst of activity and writing in the 1930s. So 1937 must have been a pivotal year. The committee that was assessing his work concluded by being weakly negative towards him in public and very negative in private. He was working on Earliest Glasgow and probably measures their origin and meaning. And in the summer of that year, he took up the trowel and the paintbrush and headed for Clydebank. Having recovered his good health and vigour, and with his intellectual opponents now out in the open, it seems more than likely that Mann was ready to fight back, finally prove he was right, whether he really was right or not. So let's start with Nappers. So Mann's probably most closely associated with his excavations at Nappers, although in truth it's actually the fripperies and the reconstructions and the showmanship that he brought to this relatively unremarkable site in a quarry, which is why he's best remembered. Mann worked there between 1937 and 1939, although the site was already known and work had started there when he finally took it on. The site of Nappers is located about 2 kilometres north of Glasgow, and it's more or less on the current boundary between Glasgow and West Dunbartonshire authorities, beside a roundabout on Great Western Road. The site was identified when that road was still called Duntaucher Boulevard during sand quarrying in 1933, and material was being extracted from a glacial drumlin that's in this location. And at the time the site was farmland, but urbanisation was creeping closer. Sorry, that's a really rubbish map to show where that was, but anyway. Here we go. So excavations of the site were initially carried out by J.M. Davidson in 1933 and 1934 on the east side of Duntaucher Boulevard. And his excavation was published very quickly in the 1935 volume of the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. He established the site was a Bronze Age kiss cemetery, which he would have dated to maybe as late as 1000 BC before radiocarbon dating, which we would now date to around 2000 to 2500 BC. And the site, as I said, was identified during quarrying, sand and gravel quarrying in 1933, when essentially a prehistoric pot was found and broken during quarrying operations and archaeologists were called in. Over the course of the next few months, as the quarry expanded, Davidson was able to identify a series of stone-lined features and excavate them. And his discoveries were supplemented by extensive riddling, as he called it, essentially sieving the sand to find more bits and pieces. And so he found a series of scattered features, which is shown in this rather rubbish plan that was produced at the time, and various things, including pits and lots of other stone-lined features. He also found Bronze Age pottery, mostly food vessel types, a bronze knife, lots of worked stone tools, lignite beads, and also cremated human bones, skull fragments, and lots of human teeth. And he also found a stone that had some rock art carved into it, which is something Ludovic Mann became very interested in, and there's a really bad image of it there from the excavation report, with lots of circular markings carved onto it. Now, Davidson's report is very sober and professional. Like most excavation reports, as Jeremy will tell you, it's really boring, actually. And what he did was essentially quite soberly contextualise the discoveries and with parallels for features of material culture that were known at the time. There's also repeated and slightly amusing complaints about how windy the site was, and he seemed to have great problem with all of his cremated bone being blown off the site before he could properly record and analyse it, which was a bit of a problem. But the report also captures well what was essentially a watching brief type operation. Davidson spent a lot of time at the quarry, or essentially on call, ready for anything to be discovered, probably adopting exactly the same methodology that Mann had developed since the 1910s. And certainly the quarry staff were drawing archaeology to his attention. So Davidson notes on 17th February, the foreman reported that bodies were becoming apparent in the sand, which must have been a very exciting moment. And one of those included a corpse which didn't have a head, but had the cremated remains of its skull lying next to it, which is a very weird Bronze Age burial, which they really couldn't make sense of. Anyway, the next phase of archaeological work that commenced here was a few years later, when on the 12th of July 1937, when quarrying started on the other side of Duntaucher Boulevard, a discovery was made of essentially a stone setting in a large pit. Mann took charge at this time. It's not really very clear why Mann suddenly appeared at this point in time, but it is explained elsewhere that during the earlier phases of excavation he was too ill to take part, so maybe Davidson just took over when Mann wasn't able to earlier on. But anyway, Mann arrived in July 1937 to excavate a series of features that were found associated with a stone setting. And he excavated these over July and August of that year. And these included a deep stone-lined pit that contained a carbonised wooden bowl and a circular setting of small stake holes associated with what Mann came to call a stone altar. He reported his results with increasing excitement and hyperbole in newspapers, and Ritchie and Addison documented scattered information about his excavations in the Scotsman, the Glasgow Herald, the Evening Times, the Clydebank Press, Glasgow Evening Citizen, and the Bulletin. There was no formal publication of these results. This was all just being pulled together from various different newspaper articles. And Ritchie and Addison note that there was a change in tone in the newspaper coverage of Mann's work at Nappers from August 1937 onwards. His accounts moved from being largely descriptive to taking on a bit more of a feverish tone. Mann's identification of a set of 12 concentric rings of stake holes, with the largest circle some 40 metres in diameter, was a catalyst for this change in tone, and by the end of the dig, he'd recorded hundreds of these small dark stains in the sandy soil in a series of circular arrangements. In the newspapers at that time, Mann described Nappers as a miniature Scottish Stonehenge in wood, and he argued that it was a site that was frequented by Druid astronomer priests. This type of comment was echoed in two booklets that Mann wrote about these excavations, published in various editions in 1937 and 1939. And such writing increasingly became part of his campaign to raise money to continue to excavate the site and preserve it for the nation. Public enthusiasm for the site was generated by articles in the broader British press, including the People and the Times, one of which claimed that Nappers was the Westminster Abbey of Scottish Druid times, which is eccentric publicity that Mann did nothing to dissuade. Now, what Mann claims to have found and what was actually there are two different things. But he did make a steady stream of similar discoveries across the summer of 1937, and the abandonment of excavation, and between then and the abandonment of excavations at the commencement of the Second World War. This kept the story in the press, and visitors kept coming along, and each discovery kept on reinforcing Mann's belief and understanding about the site, while also increasing mainstream archaeology's ambivalence and disbelief about what he was finding. Big numbers of visitors started to flock to the site soon after Mann began this publicity drive, and apparently a police guard had to be set up to stop over-enthusiastic people damaging the site, although this didn't stop vandals destroying a prehistoric pit that was identified in 1938. Now, the visitor numbers were huge, encouraged by adverts in the paper, newspaper stories, flyers like this one on the right here, and also the publication of maps like this one here, which essentially told you how to get to the Druid Temple from the centre of Glasgow by various different routeways. So when the Glasgow Archaeological Society turned up for their visit in 18 September 1937 on a Saturday, they were apparently joined by hundreds of other visitors. Now, Ritchie rather improbably claims that on one day in the summer of 1937, the Glasgow Herald reported that over 190,000 people visited the excavations, which can't possibly be right. So that's an interesting one that got through the proofreader, I think. But more realistic is Mann's own assessment that during 1938, 40,000 people visited the excavations, which is, if anything like true, is a number that any archaeologist would die for to have coming to see their work as it progresses. And what did visitors see when he arrived at this site? It wasn't just an excavation, because Mann started to reconstruct different elements of the monument according to what he thought the site would have looked like in the Neolithic period. So he created a version of the concentric arrangement of stake holes, which he called in one of his books a magnificent timber-built sacred edifice in circular form. And the central structure had lintels attached, which gave it a kind of a visual connection to Stonehenge. And other aspects of the site were constructed as well, such as a complex of curvilinear earthworks, which Mann saw akin to serpent mounds from North America, although it's very unclear how these were identified archaeologically. And there were also replica standing stones with rock art based on stones found on the site by both Mann and Davidson, which were erected as well, to give us a real sense of a prehistoric complex. And this postcard here sort of captures the reconstruction when it was at its most extreme level. Mann himself carried out public lectures on site with a programme of talks that happened in afternoons and evenings, something that must have been physically demanding for a man who by that time was in his late 60s. And given that in the summer of 1937 he was also hard at work at the Cochnostone, as we'll see, working on various pamphlets and books and maintaining his insurance broker business, Mann, Ballantyne and Company, there seems to have been a kind of frenetic energy underlying everything he did, which played itself out most explicitly as Cochno, as we'll see. Mann even found time to get the Nappers show on the road, with information on the site and artefacts showcased in the Scottish Gallery in the Golden Gate exhibition in San Francisco in 1939. His booklets on the site set out a fantastical mythology for Nappers, for the Nappers Druid or Druid's Temple, as he took to calling it, with complex symbology and mathematical precision, all pointing to what Mann saw as a material embodiment of cosmological eternal battles between good and evil. And central to this mythology was the idea of eclipses and the prediction of eclipses in prehistory and the understanding of prehistory. And Mann argued this temple was built in response to an eclipse that he said happened in Glasgow around 2983 BC, without any evidence. Yeah, aside from these fantastical explanations, Mann was also capable of quite impressive interpretations that wouldn't look out of place now in archaeology. So on the right-hand side is a rather overblown attempt to try and plan out what this enclosure and structure might have looked like. Whereas on the right we have a lovely drawing of a food vessel pot where he makes the point that the decoration, the herringbone decoration in the pot looks like the ears of cereal, which is actually exactly the kind of thing that archaeologists would say now. So he was capable of both wonderful and also deeply eccentric interpretations of the archaeology he was finding. Mann's enthusiasm for Nappers was not shared by the archaeological establishment, you might not be surprised to hear. Inspectors of ancient monuments from the Office of Works, James Richardson, refused to make Nappers a scheduled ancient monument, and he wrote at the time, to schedule this ground would only bring ridicule on the department and give an official stamp of authenticity to the fantastic diagrammatic restoration of a wooden temple. So there was no way that the authorities were going to protect this site formally or take it into their ownership. And the general consensus among archaeologists who visited the site was that Mann had misinterpreted mouse holes and mole burrows for stake holes in archaeological features, and that the site was an interesting and extensive Bronze Age cemetery, but nothing more than that. This was a blow to Mann, who nonetheless came out fighting with another pamphlet issued as late as 1945, defending his reputation, called Moles or Men, taking up the argument of what the origins of these features were. The archaeological significance of Nappers remains unclear. Adamson and Ritchie's extensive review of the archival material that remains, and also the newspaper coverage of the site and photographs, concludes that Mann did find some kind of prehistoric timber structure, and they were able to create a very rough site plan, which is highlighted in an orange box up there, which essentially is a concentric rings of small dots which are representing stake holes. And the slight nature of these posts suggests that these couldn't have supported a roof, probably also didn't have lintels, but they may have been the wooden frame for something like an earthen mound, and some parallels are suggested in the slide here with barrows from England, and also a structure in Perth and Kinross, North Mains Barrow, which seems to be an earthen barrow that had a concentric series of stake posts that were within and supporting the mound. So the conclusion was that Mann probably did a good job, but also there was lots of misinterpretation of features, including his confusion of modern gate posts with standing stones and various other things like that. But in the end, Mann's imagination and his creativity overshadowed and overinterpreted what was an interesting site, but not one in the form that he imagined it to be. The quarrying and excavations ceased at the start of the Second World War. And during that period, the site was damaged during the Clydebank Blitz in 1941. This map here, which Mark might be able to comment on the veracity of, shows that there's seems to have been one or two more or less direct hits on the site, but it seems to have survived in one form or another on aerial photographs until 1949, but then gradually it was swept away in the 1950s by a series of high-rise flats and the expansion of Great Western Road. and suddenly 1937, and the prime of this site seemed a long time in the past. Back to 1937. So 1937 was a busy summer for Ludovic Mann, but he also took close interest in a second prehistoric monument, which was probably already familiar with, the Cockno Stone. This site is located about 2 kilometres to the north of Nappers, next to Faithfully, which is a part of Clydebank. It was identified and recorded by antiquarians in the late 19th century, and is essentially as an enormous gritstone outcrop, 120 square metres of surface, covered in well over 100 cup and ring marked symbols, which were probably carved onto the stone between 3000 and 2000 BC. So it's a spectacular monument, and damage caused to the stone by Mann and also by subsequent visitors led to this being buried by the heritage authorities in 1965. And in 2016, in collaboration with Factum Arte, or a digital heritage company, and a team of students from university, we uncovered the Cockno Stone for 2 weeks to allow digital and photographic recording to go on. And this shed light, of course, on this stone in prehistory, which is interesting, but also, surprisingly, shed light on the work that Ludovic Mann did on this site as well. So Cockno was a perfect platform, really, a canvas for him to sketch out what may be the most ambitious creative act of his career, transforming this 5,000-year-old monument into a living exploded diagram showcasing his ideas about prehistoric measurements and the cosmological meaning of rock art. Mann appears to have long been familiar with the detail of the stone at Cockno, having 15 years previously compared sculpturings he observed on the island of Tiree with unusual symbols on the Cockno Stone. Moreover, with his friend and long-term collaborator George Appleby, Mann appears to have carried out previous fieldwork at Cockno. In Appleby's obituary, it's noted that both men spent the summer of 1930 camped out beside the Cockno Stone, making a rubbing of the complete surface, although no other record of this boy's own adventure or the rubbing exists, as far as I can tell. It seems natural then that Mann worked at Nappers, as Mann worked at Nappers, a site replete with concentricity and examples of portable rock art, that he would return his focus to Cockno. And when he did so in late 1937, he did it with some style. Mann essentially covered the surface of the stone with an elaborate painted grid and also filled with paint every rock art motif he could identify, an act that was ostensibly undertaken in preparation for the aforementioned visit of the Glasgow Archaeological Society. The rock art recording solicitor Ronald Morris, who came to know Mann little as their careers overlapped a little, noted that this act was carried out using either chalk or paint, and my excavations in 2016 confirmed it was the latter. Photographs from the time and accounts of the stone from local people who played on it as children suggested that more than one colour had been used by Mann in his paint job, and our excavations showed that yellow, blue, green, white and red oil paint had all been used, which were also the colours that Mann used to decorate parts of his reconstruction at Nappers. This remarkable creative act, which today would lead to arrest and prosecution, allowed Mann to express his theories on a grand scale and in a memorably visceral fashion. And although we're still processing exactly what Mann did at Cockno, the photogrammetry undertaken during the excavation and looking at rare photographs of the site from the 1930s and 60s allows us to start to reconstruct something of what this would have looked like when the stone was actually fully painted and freshly done. And the decoration on the stone seems to consist of 6 different elements: radiating lines, there's longitudinal and latitudinal lines, I suppose you could call them. There's a grid, very detailed grid with various different scales and subdivisions. There are all of the painted prehistoric symbols, and he also painted natural features, and he accidentally also painted bits of graffiti as well that he thought were prehistoric. He also added his own symbols to the stone. He painted circles onto it, and there are a few numbers written on it, like 16.8Y, which I presume refers to yards. And the focus of all seems to be a natural hollow where all of the lines radiate out from, and I'm not quite sure of the significance of that particular feature. Analysis of the paint by Louisa Campbell suggests that it was a barium sulfate. It contained barium sulfate and essentially was a white pigment that was used in paints to replace lead from the 19th century onwards. So this is probably an oil or a gloss paint that would have been purchased from the 1930s equivalent of B&Q, maybe in sunset yellow, and some kind of red and other things that were used and then painted onto the site, which is why the paint is so enduring and is still surviving. So what does all of this mean, this incredible grid? It's not that easy to make sense of, because bizarrely Mann didn't really document very much of what he was doing at this site, which is in contrast to what he did at Nappers. And there are only a few obtuse mentions of what was going on at the site in some of his Nappers publications. In the Druid Temple Explained, Mann made an explicit connection between the story he believed encoded in the timber circles and earthwork serpents at Nappers with the symbols at Cochno. And he said, perhaps the most beautiful and detailed portrayal of the battle scene between good and evil has been found in a rock carving a little to the north, which is the Cochno stone. The sculpturings covering an area of 2,000 square feet and represent an extraordinary diversity of symbols relating to important episodes in the heavens. And this is accompanied by this spectacular diagram, which is published also in the Druids Temple near Glasgow, and it's entitled Harmony of the Spheres. And it shows just 2 of the 40-plus cup and ring mark symbols on the stone, and it depicts this with an incredibly obsessive level of detail, where every element of these cup and ring marks refers to a planet or to an element of a bigger cosmological scheme. And this is all about the defeat of the monster that swallows the sun, which is what causes eclipses. So it's tied in with a kind of eclipse mythology. He talks about this rock art motif being a picture of the sun god eclipsed and swallowed by the evil serpent, which envelopes the cup, but is contorted and about to be defeated. And this amazing drawing mimics Mann's plans and sketches and reconstructions of Nappers, and indicates both sites were interpreted within the same cosmological prehistoric mystic framework of serpents and gods, mythical battles and the sun and the moon, with some eclipse theories thrown in. As well as connecting both sites through mythology and their connection to the eclipse, Mann also played out his prehistoric measurement obsession at Cochno to a quite incredible level, and this photograph here of a bit of the stone that Mann painted is quite remarkable. Mann published one booklet on measurements in 1930 and was already probably working in his riposte to the committee that had been set up just to disprove all of his theories. And his response, I think, was to treat the Cochno stone as if it was a one-to-one scale piece of graph paper. And the focus on the Cochno stone here on this north side of the stone is absolutely incredible, obsessive level of detail in painting, depicting all of these different gradations and lines and so on, these kind of megalithic rulers that he's trying to draw in the stone. None of this detail really survived in the stone when we uncovered it a few years ago, but these photographs gives a really good insight into what's going. And it seems that Mann essentially has got this join the dots exercise where cup and ring marks cup marks, these hollows, are being connected by lines, and there's all sorts of other stuff going on as well. And these apparently random patterns, which sort of looks a bit like that when you transcribe it. So this network of circles and straight lines, which seems to be entirely random, was actually a trait of Mann's previous work at other megalithic sites in Scotland, although this is by far the grandest effort that he had, and some of the others may have been done using chalk. Photographs show that similar but smaller scale schemes were painted on or chalked onto standing stones at Strathblane near Glasgow and a Dagon stone at Darvel in Ayrshire. And he even painted one of his grids onto the Old Wife's Lift in Craigmadie Moor, which is north of Glasgow, which is a natural rock formation which may have some prehistoric or later prehistoric carvings onto it. He also sketched elements of a grid with straight lines and circles, and then other symbols are painted onto this kiss stone that he excavated at Patrick Home in Hamilton, along with the rather ominous words, "Don't disturb." So for Mann, these grids were his attempt to find out and or demonstrate the existence of consistent prehistoric measurements as alpha and beta schemes. He was tirelessly trying to find these measurements whenever he worked with ancient objects and monuments, noting, for instance, when he opened up a prehistoric kist burial in a pub car park in Strathblane, he found the capstone had incised into it, as he said, the ancient lineal scales set at right angles and with perfect accuracy, although no photographs or drawings appear to exist of this discovery. Katinka Dalgleish, who's studying Mann's archive within Glasgow Life's collections, has told me of pages and pages in his notebooks covered in these odd geometric diagrams, accompanied by measurements and rambling notes that make little sense. Mann's work at the Cochno stone is remarkable in many ways. The creativity, craftsmanship and confidence required to paint this grid onto the stone is breathtaking, with some of the yellow lines on the grid perfectly straight and running for more than 8 meters in length. There's a consistency of purpose that can only be admired. His obsessive reading of every carved depression in the surface of the stone, his connection of motifs with stories and planets, suggest he crawled over the surface of the stone, as he's actually shown doing here in this photograph, feeling his way into its deep time, perhaps trying to achieve some kind of symbiosis with its surface, tracing his way into prehistoric mindset with his fingers. He left a stone that was utterly changed, and as with Nappers, he added more than he took away, leaving visitors in no doubt that this monument had become a monument. Pause for laughter. People who played on the stone as children had told me that the most vivid memories of the appearance of the stone was the brightly coloured symbols and lines, not the cups and rings. The paint job carried out by Mann and Appleby in summer 1937 had negative consequences for both the private landowners of the site and also the heritage authorities. Mann's work, coupled with his public visibility due to nappers, raised the profile of the Cocknell stone considerably, and this soon became a source of concern for the landowner of one half of the Cocknell stone at that time, a Mr. Walter Kinloch. Kinloch's solicitor wrote a letter to the Office of Works on 13 September 1937, stating that as a result of the activities of certain antiquarians, i.e. Ludovic Mann, who have expended much care in the decoration of the monument, a considerable amount of public interest has recently been directed to the stone, with the result that large numbers of people from the surrounding industrial district and elsewhere are in the habit of visiting the site, particularly at weekends. A few days after the Kinloch letter, an Office of Works official, naming himself only as JSR, who is in fact the same James Richardson who later refused to schedule nappers, wrote in an internal memo that unfortunately a commotion has arisen owing to the fact that Mr. Ludovic Mann has done considerable harm to the appearance of the sculpturing through the application of oil paints and a confusion of pseudo-astronomical articulation of lines. Eventually, this back and forth of letters and so on led to this monument becoming a scheduled ancient monument in December 1937. And arguments continued for years and years as to what to do with the Cocknell stone, whether the paint should be cleaned off or not. But eventually, the increasing vandalism and damage to the stone that happened over the subsequent decades led to the stone in 1965 being buried completely by the authorities, 10 years after Mann's death and 28 years after Ludovic Mann painted its surface. So 81 years after Mann's frenetic and supposedly redemptive summer in Clydebank in 1937, we're now able to place the significance of both sites in a more realistic archaeological context and assess their value to us as heritage sites. Nappers can be viewed as one of many early Bronze Age cemeteries across Britain, with a fine assemblage of food vessels and possibly a very unusual timber-laced barrow structure. And the Cocknell stone has been recognised as one of the largest and most densely decorated panels of the Neolithic and Bronze Age period in Britain. But curiously, the real legacy of both sites may not be their prehistoric incarnations, but the information associated with them that tells a story of the early years of archaeology as a profession in Scotland. Mann's work at Cocknell in 1937 and Nappers between 1937 and 1939 were actually extended attempts to educate and engage the public about the sophistication of Neolithic and Bronze Age people, innovative acts that we would now call public archaeology. And his struggle with the authorities tells of an emergent discipline that is yet to reach maturity. And it's this public archaeology legacy that remains unrealised. The prehistory of Clydebank is little known even to the people who live there, and to outsiders the town is most closely associated with the Clydebank Blitz, shipbuilding and wet, wet, wet. Visiting Cocknell and Nappers today, encountering these two urban prehistory sites can be viewed as a dispiriting experience, which is certainly not what future Mann had in mind for both sites. Nappers is today unrecognisable as a place that was a farmland and a quarry less than a century ago, never mind a location of sacred significance in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. It's now beside a busy intersection with the drumlin barely discernible amidst the suburban architecture and road infrastructure. The quarry edge can still be traced along the grass verge on the west side of the road, but high-rise flats in a 1990s housing estate cover the remainder of the site to east and west. Yet the architecture of urban dwelling and the car curiously reflects the Neolithic structures that Mann was so enthused by, circular bays of garages, roundabouts, towering uprights, landscaped stone blocks and playgrounds. Households on the east side of the road sit on the location of an ancient cemetery, excavated not just by Davidson in the 1930s, but also Guard archaeology 6 decades later. And next to all of this is a bizarre arrangement of animatronic dinosaurs, prehistory upon prehistory. But there's nothing to tell the residents here or visitors of the rich prehistoric and archaeological heritage that was played out here. No plaques, no notice boards, no apps, nothing online really to give a sense of what was played out in this location. The same can be said for the Cocknell stone to an extent as well. The site, which is the largest of 16 rock art panels in the area, is located in an urban green space on the fringe of Faifley. Then the rock art here is largely being ignored by the archaeological community, with much more attention focused on glamorous places like Argyll. And the heritage sector actively sought to stop the local community from visiting this site with the 1965 burial. This conservative and unimaginative response to a heritage problem has caused a long-term disenfranchisement of the community from their own heritage. The only notice boards that were ever located here, and I showed one of those earlier on, even explicitly mention the rock art has been buried to protect it from modern people. However, work I've been doing with the local community and the Cocknowstone is starting to change this situation, and there's now a group, the Friends of the Cocknowstone, who are actively developing a strategy to use the stone and the rock art to rebrand faithfully, with a programme of public events and work with schools, raising awareness of the 5 millennium-old sites on their doorstep. And this has even been used to brand the university's new Cocknow wool, which has got symbols from the Cocknowstone on its labels. The story of Ludovic McLellan Mann was also the basis for a Being Human project that I got funding for last year, where Hannah Sackett, an archaeologist and illustrator, designed a comic book that was explicitly telling the story of the stone and Ludovic Mann that could then be transmitted to school children in comic book form. And they produced, local school children produced hundreds of comic strips telling the story of the stone, some of them depicting Ludovic Mann with an enormous yellow pencil or bit of chalk. And also, we also had well over 100 eclipse monsters drawn as well, and these were all exhibited to the local public as well, part of the awareness raising and the kind of the enrichment of the heritage of this area through telling Ludovic Mann's story. And the story of Mann at the Cocknowstone was one that children loved because of the colourful narrative that Mann developed to explain the mysterious symbols in the stone, and his engagement with Cocknow that was both playful and naughty. Ludovic Mann never again reached the heights of popularity or notoriety that he did in 1937, and his archaeological career, contrary to his expectations, went into steady decline. By going over the top at Nappers, as Ritchie expressed it, and through his almost illegal activities at Cocknow, Mann alienated himself from his peers, the government and academic archaeologists, frustrated his career and smeared him. Ritchie notes that Mann gave the impression in his final years as being someone disappointed, lonely and ill. He died on 30 September 1955, aged 86, and in his will left provision for the site of Nappers to be preserved and put into public ownership, although it appears that this final wish was ignored. Yet those who worked closely with Mann, such as George Appleby, remain loyal and supportive even after his death. Now, with ongoing research into the archives by Kintinkle Dalgleish and Jim Mearns, the process of Mann's rehabilitation is gathering pace, and to mark the 150th anniversary of his birth, I'm hoping to hold a series of events over 2019, including a conference here at the university, walking tours, an edited volume of some kind, and also hopefully a blue plaque campaign to be put on where Mann lived the last years of his life in the West End of Glasgow. And Mann's legacy hopefully will also be evident in Clydebank, with a planned exhibition of his work in the town and ongoing public archaeology associated with the Cocknowstone. In an obituary of Mann written in 1955, Jack Scott suggested that Mann perhaps simply tried too hard to study prehistoric people. His assertion that Neolithic people were sophisticated and intelligent may have played itself out in misleading directions, but it stood in direct contrast to the more general view of archaeologists such as Gordon Childe, who even as late as the 1930s still viewed Stone Age people as savages. Mann's attempt to use anthropological parallels to understand religion, ritual, language, and social organisation came at a time when academic archaeologists believed that such aspects of life were beyond the scope of their discipline. In other words, he was pushing at the boundaries of archaeology. One doesn't need to buy into all of Mann's ideas and obsessions to recognise he was an innovator. He was a man of his time, a polymath with the means to explore his hobbies and the means to publish his research. Despite the tangents and eccentricities, Mann's work also played a major role in the development of archaeology in Scotland in the 1900s and 1930s, and he played out a series of creative approaches to the past that we would now comfortably call anything from public archaeology to psychogeography. His legacy is yet to be fully understood and realised, and perhaps his career will be forever overshadowed by one epic summer in Clydebank in 1937. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenny. Any questions? So his kind of mystical interpretation of what's going on, has there been studies to support? I mean, did he just make it up, or was he drawing on a sort of mystical tradition that supported some of the interpretations or stories of?
It was a lot of it was coming from his study of things like Celtic mythology, the work he'd done looking at other cultures around the world. So he was interested in South American cultures. He was interested in archaeoastronomy and different theories about how the sun and the moon related to people. It was like a whole mishmash of all sorts of stuff that came together. So I don't think most of the ideas weren't necessarily original. And some of these things, like he was obsessed with the god Lud being part of the kind of mythology of Glasgow, which is something that had been argued for London as well. And something which is now celebrated by psychogeographers. So he was kind of part of a tradition at that time, which was kind of romantic and eclectic and eccentric, and he kind of brought together all this stuff together, most of which had no real basis in fact, but it was a kind of a framework for thinking through things. And so he was trying to make sense of the archaeological stuff he found in ways that at that time were completely original. Because at that time, anyone who found, if anyone found any of these kind of structures, they were explained in a very kind of mundane and straightforward and historical kind of way. Whereas Mann was trying to think, okay, well, let's think about what did this mean to people, what were they trying to do, what was their religion? And he was trying to find all these other different sources, almost occult sources to try and explain that. So it was very much part of that kind of broader movement at that time, I think, and he was bringing in all these diverse sources. And that was something that the establishment just couldn't accept. And even now, we wouldn't really accept most of these ideas.
But have lots of people been writing on the occult basis for Glasgow then? Is that?
Not really, no. I mean, I think the strange thing is it sort of was ignored. The only real attempt to try and make sense of this was by Harry Bell, who was another amateur archaeologist who was at work in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, and he started with some of the work that Mann did, looking at prehistoric alignments in Glasgow, and then created what he called a network of aligned sites, which is essentially a ley line scheme for Glasgow. And then he published that himself as well, because he was a publisher by trade and his own publisher in his garage. So he published this wonderful book, Glasgow's Secret Geometry. So that was a kind of riff on Mann, really. It took what Mann did and then it just exploded into this incredible vision of prehistoric Glasgow, riddled with these routeways and pathways that connect up castles and churches and necropolis and random prehistoric sites and hill forts beyond the bounds of the city and all sorts of things. So there have been more modern attempts, but all that stuff has been completely dismissed by the archaeological establishment. But Bell was also shunned and ignored by, apart from friends who just kind of laughed at him along, because he was also an amateur surveyor and archaeologist as well. So, but my contention is that we shouldn't just dismiss these ideas, we should actually look at the creativity and the methodologies and the ideas that underlie all of these things and think about these as really creative ways to understand the past landscapes and understand prehistoric people in the past, and actually to try and give them agency, which all too often archaeologists until quite recently were not really about giving agency to individuals in the past or thinking about religion and how that played itself out. So in many ways he was ahead of the curve in the way he thought about archaeology, but even now almost none of Mann's ideas would be taken seriously.
Kenny, I know that in the late 30s he was writing to some professor in Berlin whose name escapes me, who was meant to be the astronomer of the time to validate his eclipse dating. I think he sort of dated it to something like 3 p.m.
It was very good. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 6th day after the spring equinox, which is March 27th, 2883 BC.
Right, super. Has that trail gone completely cold? Did whoever the professor in Berlin was survive the RAF?
If that correspondence is within his archive, then Katinka will have looked at it or will be looking at it, because she's looking at all his letters. Because most of that stuff was held by George Appleby's family and then went over to Glasgow Life into the Royal Commission in Edinburgh. So that large body of correspondence is there and hasn't really been, it's been looked at by Katinka, but none of that stuff has been published or synthesised yet. So I'm not quite sure. And this is very much in the tradition of Norman Lockyer, who argued the date of Stonehenge. In about 1908, he argued the date of Stonehenge was something or other, I can't remember what it was, based on an association with certain solar alignments. So it was a tradition back then of kind of retrofitting the date of prehistoric monuments by trying to associate them with an astronomical event. As it happens, Mann's date was probably about right, because he was pre-radiocarbon dating, so no one back then thought that prehistory went back as far as 3000 BC, so he accidentally stumbled on more or less the correct date for the monument he was looking at, probably. But he did that by this, I don't know how he worked it when this eclipse happened, so that's something that Katinka might be able to shed more light on. And I haven't looked at a lot of his notebooks and journals yet either, so.
Thank you for that.
Yes. So you've talked about quite nicely how there are certain things that Ludovic Mann did that are ahead of his time, successful kind of things that we would now do in archaeology. But it strikes me that the other side of it is that he is essentially a pseudo-archaeologist. And all the problems that we have now is pseudo-archaeology. And I was just wondering, so you're looking at Mann, you're learning how he went through things, and you're talking and you're explaining to people what his ideas were. How does that fit into the idea that we probably don't really want to be supporting and spreading pseudo-archaeological techniques?
I think the way I look at it is that even pseudo-archaeology is a valid area of study because it's a body of theory and methodology to try and understand the past. So you don't have to accept that that's necessarily an accurate way to, or even an ethical way to think about the past, but you can still kind of study the processes that underpin that, and often you can actually start to undermine pseudo-archaeologists by actually exposing flaws in the methodology and the logic and the arguments and showing why it's problematic. So part of the re-evaluation of Mann has to be a kind of an exposure of the methodology adopted in terms of these intellectual thought processes that were just all over the place and not based in any kind of logic or reality, and that ultimately that side of his output is deeply problematic. I don't think that necessarily validates celebrating much of the other stuff that he did during his career and trying to look at that in a whole. So I mean, I'm not standing here saying, we should all go back to thinking about prehistoric sites in these ways, but actually what he was doing was within a tradition that became more standard in post-processual archaeology, with thinking about symbolism, thinking about connections in ritual practice, understanding prehistoric religion, and it may well be that his sources are irrelevant and don't make any sense in relation to prehistoric Scotland, but that's what for him seemed to work at the time. So I'm not standing here advocating that pseudo-archaeology is great and that we should celebrate it, but I do think that in Mann's case, in the same way as Alfred Watkins is worthy of study. You can believe or disbelieve ley lines, but again he was doing some very interesting stuff that we now call psychogeography. So there's things, connections there that are quite interesting from this period of people working at this time that are interesting and worthy of study, even if we ultimately don't accept their interpretations of the past.
We're out of time, I'm afraid. Let's thank Kenny again for a fascinating talk.